Mr. President, since we briefed the Security Council on Ukraine 2 weeks ago, Russian Federation airstrikes have continued to kill and maim civilians, including children, and to destroy civilian infrastructure. A massive strike in the densely populated city of Kryvyi Rih in the Dnipro region last Friday resulted in multiple civilian casualties, the second fatal attack on the city in a week. According to the authorities, 18 civilians were killed, including 9 children, and 75 others injured when a children's playground and nearby residential area were hit. The Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Ukraine, which verified many of the casualties, reported that this was the single deadliest strike harming children since February 2022. In recent weeks, drone attacks have continued to strike cities and cause civilian casualties. Civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, apartment blocks, schools, and children's playgrounds, have suffered extensive damage. This brutal pattern of civilian death and destruction in populated areas must stop. Hostilities have also continued in the frontline regions of Kherson, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and the border areas of Sumy, causing extensive damage. More than 90 civilian casualties were recorded in those regions last week, according to authorities. I saw the impact of these types of attacks firsthand when I visited Ukraine earlier this year. From the families I met in frontline areas near Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region to Kupiansk town in the Kharkiv region, they displayed courage, resilience, and determination to rebuild their lives and their homes. But also understandable exhaustion, anger, and despair that these attacks continue. Mr. President, they are right to be angry because civilians are paying a devastating price for this horrendous war. OHCHR has now verified the killing of at least 12,910 civilians, including 682 children, and the injury of almost 30,700 across Ukraine from 24th of Feb 2022 to 31st of March 2025. The true toll is likely to be far greater. Nearly 3.7 million people remain internally displaced, with new waves of displacement in the country's northeast due to hostilities. Children and their caregivers are being evacuated from several frontline towns. There are almost 7 million refugees from Ukraine recorded globally, mainly in Europe. Media reports also indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions of the Russian Federation. And we remain unable to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians who require assistance in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions under occupation by the Russian Federation. International humanitarian law demands that the parties facilitate rapid, unimpeded access for humanitarian relief for those civilians in need, wherever they are. Mr. President, yesterday marked World Health Day, a moment to reflect on the urgent need to safeguard maternal and reproductive health, especially in crisis settings. A new report released by WHO, UNFPA, and UNICEF highlights the state of maternal mortality worldwide, including the devastating toll of conflict on women's health. In Ukraine, women and girls are facing a special crisis. Since February 2022, preterm births have made up nearly 50% of all deliveries, putting both mothers and newborns at high risk. Intimate partner violence, including other forms of gender-based violence, has surged 36% during this period. Displaced women, especially refugees, are among those facing the most severe mental health challenges, with limited access to protection and care. Mr. President, almost 13 million people across Ukraine need humanitarian support. The majority are women, children, older people, and people with disabilities. In the first 2 months of 2025, 290 humanitarian organizations, many national NGOs, reached 1.7 million people with vital aid and services, including emergency support following strikes. Thanks to the generosity of donors, 17% of the $2.6 billion needed for the 2025 Ukraine Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan that I launched with Filippo Grandi in January in Kyiv has been secured. But far more is clearly needed. And of course, now we're having to scale back critical programs. As part of our wider humanitarian reset in response to funding cuts, we and partners are focusing limited resources on just 4 strategic, urgent priorities: supporting frontline communities, the emergency response, facilitating evacuations, and helping the displaced. Increased financial support is vital to ensure humanitarian operations can continue reaching those most in need. Every contribution makes a difference. Mr. President, we welcome the announcement of a ceasefire focused on energy infrastructure, as well as negotiations to ensure safe navigation in the Black Sea. Ultimately, the best protection of civilians is that this war ends. Until it does, the negotiating priority, whether as part of a temporary pause or a lasting agreement, must start from the needs and protection of civilians. And while talks continue, the fighting rages on. Civilians continue to suffer, and the humanitarian crisis deepens by the day. Mr. President, my 2 asks today of the Security Council, and indeed the wider international community, go beyond Ukraine alone. Firstly, I must reiterate that under international humanitarian law that this Council is here to defend, parties to conflicts must protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians are strictly prohibited. There must be limits to how war is waged. At its best, this Council and the member states here have upheld that idea that even wars have rules. Is that not why we are here? And yet, on my visits from Ukraine to Gaza, to Sudan, to Lebanon, to Myanmar, from where I returned yesterday, I'm seeing the opposite. That not only are we not standing robustly for international law, but in some cases we are supporting its debasement. That's the common thread that links these conflicts. And if your principles apply only to your opponents, then they are not humanitarian principles. The world is getting more dangerous for civilians. On our watch, please, you can do more to ensure that this era of increasingly belligerent, transactional, self-defeating nationalism is not also remembered as one of callous impunity and brutal indifference, in which the rights of civilians are discarded again and again with a shrug. If we do not make our stand on this point consistently and unequivocally, then what do we stand for anymore? And how can we expect anyone to listen to us or hope that others will make better choices in the future? My second ask, Mr. President, is, of course, for the funding to save lives in an increasingly dangerous environment and this era of savage cuts. If you cannot stop the attacks on civilians in Ukraine and elsewhere, please at least give us the security to operate and the resources we need to save as many survivors as we can. Thank you, Mr. President.